This panel is entitled Democratic Institutions in Movement, and I'm happy to present our participants. We have here to my left Bojan Bogaric. He's a professor of law in the University of Sheffield. Before coming to Sheffield, he lectured at the University of Ljubljana, and he has held visiting positions at the University of Trento, the UCLA, and the Center for European Studies in Harvard University. He's interested in constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, public law, EU law, law and democracy, and law and development. And he studied law as an undergrad at the University of Ljubljana, graduated LLM at UCLA Los Angeles, and wrote his doctorate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. To my right, we have Carla Bezerra. Carla Bezerra is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of São Paulo and a researcher at the Center for the Studies of the Metrópole at the Brazilian Analysis and Planning Center. We also have Henrique Almeida de Castro, here to my left. He's a PhD student at the University of São Paulo Law School and a member of the Law and Policy Research Group. He holds a doctoral scholarship from the São Paulo Research Foundation, and his work seeks to understand how legal arrangements shape actors' interactions within state structures. And joining us on Skype is Michael Heiner. He is a postdoctoral researcher at Humboldt University, Berlin, where he also completed his PhD on the law of international development institutions. He holds an LLM from NYU School of Law and is a co-editor of the journal VRU on World Comparative Law. His publications focuses on international institutional law, comparative constitutional law, and the global south. We thank you very much for being with us here today, and we thank all of you for listening to what seems to be a very promising panel. And Michael, should we start with you?
Yes, if you like, I can start. Can you hear me well?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for the accommodation of my Skype presentation. I was unable to travel, but I'm all the more grateful that I can be with you. I sent my text in writing, so in case something goes wrong with the Skype connection, I hope that everyone can follow at some point the text in written form. So I'd like to preface my presentation with one remark, of course, on the conference title and on my own position. The title is Law and Development, New Institutional Approaches from the Global South. Now, obviously, I'm not from the Global South, and I do not claim to speak for the Global South, but I'm a comparative lawyer, and I believe that there is value in comparisons across the North-South divide, especially when they address entanglements and interdependencies between North and South in a globalized economy. And one such institution that I think embodies a lot of these entanglements is the cooperation. And one of the entanglements that I'd like to focus on today is the relationship between democracy on the one hand and corporate power in a globalized economy on the other. This is also the subject of my larger postdoctoral project, on which this presentation is based, and which explains the somewhat maybe preposterous title that I've given to this talk, namely Corporate Capitalism and Democracy. So with that, I will start with the written presentation and hope that you can follow me. So the paper tries to make an intervention in the controversy about capitalism versus democracy, which has resurged since the financial crisis in Europe and the US, but in my perspective has been even more vigorous before that and for quite some time in the Global South. From a legal perspective, the categories of capitalism and democracy are obviously too general to allow for a targeted debate, so legal analysis needs to disaggregate both variables. To do so, I focus on one institution that is arguably an important but neglected institutional hinge between the economy and democracy, the corporation. I propose to reframe the controversy as a debate about the relationship between corporate capitalism and democracy. And to describe this relationship, I make 4 claims in my paper and justify them with insights from institutional analysis, political economy, and political theory. So the 4 claims are the following. First is corporations and not markets are the defining institution of advanced capitalism. Secondly, corporations are not only economic and legal entities, but also, to some extent, political institutions. And thirdly, as such, they are subject to requirements and principles of political legitimacy, especially democracy. Finally and fourthly, the relationship between corporate capitalism and democracy also depends on the legal structure of both democratic and capitalist institutions, including the legal structure of the corporation. So I will address each of these 4 claims in turn. Firstly, corporations are the defining institution of advanced capitalism. Modern law may have moved from status to contract, but did not stop there. It moved on from contract to organization, and especially corporate organizations. As David Shipley writes, quote, "We do not live in a market society relating to one another as independent producers and sellers bound together by a web of bilateral contracts. Rather, we live in a corporate organizational society relating to one another within and across organizations," unquote. The capitalism versus democracy controversy thus needs to be reframed, I suggest, as a debate about the relationship between corporate capitalism and democracy. Both concepts need to be further disaggregated to develop legal theories and testable hypotheses concerning the relationship of the 2 concepts. In doing so, the analytical framework needs to allow for institutional variation of both variables. That is, recognize the fact that institutional arrangements of both corporate capitalism and democracy vary considerably across jurisdictions. Secondly, corporations are not only economic and legal entities, but also political institutions. As legal institutions, corporations have institutional features that markets and contracts alone cannot generate spontaneously, like legal personality, limited liability, and internal hierarchy and jurisdiction. As, like Catherine Pista, for example, has shown, mainstream economic theories of the corporation neglect these specifically legal features and, importantly, the role of the state in their creation. Besides, and contrary to conventional wisdom, corporations are also political institutions. This claim can be justified with 3 types of arguments: legal, historical, empirical, functional, and moral, political. First, historically and legally, the corporation is of governmental provenance. Prior to the 19th century liberalization, the corporation was not understood as a private business technology, but a form of public governance with corresponding privileges and obligations. Legally, the corporation used to be created by public charter or concession, and until today, it depends on the state for acquiring its distinct legal features and privileges. Secondly, empirically, corporations perform functions and exercise authority in ways that are sometimes functionally equivalent to the state. Corporations provide public goods and services that used to be provided by the state, such as security, transport, education, water. Internally, corporations establish and enforce hierarchies that most workers cannot escape without viable exit options, and externally, they have economic, discursive, and structural leverage, or some would prefer to say power, over consumers, contractors, political actors, and even states. Under some conditions, they exercise quasi-sovereign authority akin to legislative, executive, and judicial power. Based on these prior arguments, political theorists like David Shipley, Elizabeth Anderson, or Edward Singer argue that corporations should be held to a higher standard of public morality than purely private agents. So this leads to the third claim, which is that democracy is not only an organizing principle for the state, but also relevant to the corporation. If corporations are political institutions that are sometimes functionally equivalent to the state, then this implies in principle that principles of political legitimacy, like democracy, are also applicable to these institutions. This general claim about democracy does not necessarily translate into one specific institutional arrangement. How it applies to the corporation depends on which concept of democracy is pursued and may translate into differing institutional arrangements. So, social liberals might think of democracy as regulation of corporations by democratic legislature. Others, or another option, is political control of the economy through state-owned enterprises, as championed by socialists and with respect to natural resources by most post-colonial states in the new international economic order era. Thirdly, democracy might also mean industrial democracy and coalition arrangements, as preferred by traditional social democrats and neo-republican theories of the firm. Now, this brings me to the last claim on the relationship between corporate capitalism and democracy, which I argue depends on the legal structure of democratic and capitalist institutions, including the legal structure of the corporation. So there is no necessary relationship between corporate capitalism and democracy, and whether that relationship is one of contradiction, causation, mutual dependence, or elective affinity depends, at least partly, on how law structures processes and institutions of democracy and of corporate capitalism. While the legal structure of democracy has been relatively well researched, in some jurisdictions at least, the democratic implications of the corporations as a legal and political institution are less well understood. And this opens up an interdisciplinary research program for comparative lawyers and legal institutionalists. In this paper, I can only sketch 4 potential avenues for future comparative and legal institutional research that might be relevant across the North-South divide. I will give you a flavor and name some examples for each of these 4. The first is constitutional rights of corporations. The second is legal structure of corporate influence on democracy. The third is state-owned enterprises as a vehicle of democracy, ? And the fourth is corporations as a site of democracy. Now, the first, constitutional rights of corporations. In many legal orders, corporations enjoy not only private rights to property and contracting, but also constitutional rights. The extent to which constitutional rights protect corporations determines the possibilities for democratic majorities to regulate economic activity and redistribute resources. In practice, constitutional orders vary widely in the extent and in the justification of constitutional protections for corporations, and thus in the way how they separate the economy and politics. Generally, preliminarily, there seems to be a tendency for liberal constitutions to grant stronger corporate rights, whereas social democratic and transformative constitutions allow legislators more leeway. Comparative law has yet to systematize and theorize these tendencies across the North-South divide and relate them to theories of democratic legitimacy, which tend to be built around individual human beings and citizens, and not legal persons. Although in many jurisdictions, the majority of legal claims, constitutional claims, is being brought by corporate actors. Secondly, the legal structure of corporate influence on democracy. Corporations influence democratic processes and institutions directly, for instance through political speech, influence on deliberation and campaign finance, or indirectly through exercising mobility and regulatory arbitrage. The nature and extent of this influence also depends on legal arrangements, such as constitutional protections of corporate political speech and campaign finance, transnational free movement rights, and the allocation of regulatory competences in federal and multi-level systems. Constitutional orders contrast starkly in these respects. For instance, as you know, the US Supreme Court conceives corporate campaign finance as free speech that contributes to the marketplace of ideas, and consequently has liberalized corporate campaign finance, again in Citizens United in 2010. In contrast, the Brazilian Supreme Court has banned direct campaign contributions in a 2015 judgment, which prompted Foreign Affairs to title Latin America versus Citizens United. Unquote. The third avenue of research concerns state-owned enterprises as a potential vehicle for democracy. While economic accounts of public corporations tend to focus on their efficiency or their lack thereof, their potential role as a vehicle for democratic interventions into the economy has received less attention since demands for a new international economic order have faded away. Yet public enterprises continue to play a frequently underestimated role in almost all varieties of capitalism and constitutionalism in North and South. This ranges from public utilities in liberal constitutional market economies like the US via democratic quasi-state capitalism under a transformative constitution like in Brazil to non-democratic authoritarian state capitalism like in China. If and how state-owned enterprises might be a device for reconciling corporate capitalism and democracy, it thus raises important legal questions for comparative constitutional law and legal institutionalism. This includes, for instance, separation of powers questions, which are frequently raised in such systems. For instance, the question whether legislatures or executives ultimately control state-owned enterprises, public investments, and their privatization. I think the Brazilians are familiar with recent case law in this regard. Finally, in coming to a conclusion with this, corporations as a site of democracy. There is a long tradition of conceiving the corporation itself as a site and object of democracy. This ranges from social democratic ideas of industrial democracy or workplace democracy via Latin American cooperative movements to neo-republican theories of the corporate farm. Recent approaches seek to extend worker co-determination and shareholder democracy to other stakeholders, like local communities affected by development projects. This raises the question of how to legally structure these institutional arrangements in a way that conforms to democratic ideals also in institutional practice. This is not an easy task, as the experiences with German co-determination, for example, indicate, about which Katharina Pista, for example, has written. Still, the attraction of firm-based democracy is that, unlike most other models, it does not depend on a functioning, territorially bounded, state-based democracy. This enables new institutional thinking about democratic configurations across borders and along structures of economic organization and production. This is important for the Global South because it might give southern populations a say in global economic regimes and value chains by virtue of labor and natural resources and not just capital investments. On this hopeful note, I conclude and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Michael.
When you're ready.
Yeah, thank you. Is this okay if I'm...
No, I cannot hear you.
Maybe only this one is connected to Skype.
Okay.
No, it's just the phone was closed for now.
Is it?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So
Should we say?
yeah, but I cannot talk like this. So is this? I'm still okay? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. So my talk is going to be a little different because I'll just say a few words about my work, what I'm working on, and then just share with you some open issues, open questions that I encounter in my work. I also share interest in political economy and law and development, but my core work has been for the last 3-4 years law, populism, and democracy. So I've been studying the relationship between law, democracy, and populism, how one of these three things affect each other. And the first point, and also maybe the story behind it, why I was so interested, because everything started in my part of the world. So before I moved to the UK, I'm Eastern European, I lived in Eastern Europe, and as many other times in history, we in Eastern Europe usually export only bad things to other parts of the world. So kind of, semi-authoritarian, authoritarian, and similar parts of the world, of the regimes were quite a commonality in the history of Central and Eastern Europe. So here we are again. So Hungarians, Poles, I don't have time to go into the detailed description of those regimes. I don't know how much you follow these comparative developments about the world, but to put it briefly, they established what is now defined, called in the media as authoritarian, illiberal, populist, different names of regimes, which basically turn democracy into some kind of a sham. And they represent an interesting form because they're quite novel, because the way the authoritarianism is established is not by some kind of a coup d'etat. So you're not seeing tanks on the street, you're not seeing military and police. It's basically done by democracy and under the mask of law. So these are two very interesting features of this new type of populist authoritarianism. So populist authoritarianism, they use democracy. They go to the polls. They ask people to support them. And in fact, if you look at the current polls, Hungary is still, the government is still very much supported by people. Orban has been now in power for, 9 years? And he is still close to 40-45% of citizens. So these are not authoritarians as we used to know them in the past. Similarly can be said about the Poles. So that just briefly to give you sort of kind of idea of what kind of populist authoritarianism are we talking about. So this is a different, a novel type. So it deserves a special attention, a study, analysis of this new type. So if you walk, and now with your new president, you are, slowly welcome to the club. So you will, much of the world will start to study, also the Brazilian version of. I have to be careful because it's president has been just elected, so we need some time before we throw out a, strong words qualification. But if you read the media, it pretty much seems to be an emphasis that is a form of authoritarian populism. And another important thing that this is not anymore some kind of Eastern European peculiarity is the fact that the three largest democracies in the world, USA, India, and Brazil, in terms of population, are now all ruled by authoritarian populists. So there must be something behind this phenomenon. Then I move further, and I also want to emphasize another thing. So because everything started in Eastern Europe, there's a tendency in the literature to use the framework which originated during the early years of Orban in Hungary and Kaczynski in Poland to extrapolate that funding to other cases of populism around the world. And I would not say that there are not many commonalities, many common patterns when you look at the global pattern, but I would like more to emphasize also the differences. So I think we have to be careful before we put too much of a sort of identification between these different types, and I would rather emphasize the variation, not to use necessarily the varieties because it's been overused. We had these varieties of capitalism and varieties of many different things. So I don't want to now repeat it and say that there's varieties of populism. I just want to say that there are different versions of populism with different both political, constitutional, and political economy consequences in different parts of the world. I think for this part, don't have enough time to further explain. I would just, for example, wanted to mention here one very interesting difference between the Eastern European model and, for example, the Brazilian and the American one. And I think that's my sort of, I would have to say more intuition than really work out hypothesis, is that the fact that both Eastern European cases represent a very interesting combination of political constitutional authoritarianism, but also in terms of social policies, almost a left-wing, socially friendly oriented welfare policies, the reason for their durability. So for the fact that people still support Orban and Kaczynski, despite the fact that these guys are taking away the liberties from the people, they're taking away, universities have to, the most important, the best university in Central and Eastern European, Soros University, Central Eastern European University, had to move from Budapest to Vienna, to Vienna. So this tells you a lot about the freedom of ideas, of freedom of education, and so on. But despite that fact, people find these regimes as good, and they support them because they give them money, they give them social programs, which were largely, not entirely, but largely abandoned by previous center-left governments in both countries. So that's another interesting feature of the Eastern European phenomenon. It was the center-left social democrats who implemented most of neoliberal reforms in the last 2 mandates. So the people felt that these new populists, no matter that they are authoritarian, they are giving them, throwing them money. For example, in Poland, the most popular program is called so-called 500 zloty plus, which basically distributes money to people, to families with 2 and more children. Of course, for all feminists and left-minded people, this is very problematic because it establishes certain sort of understanding of the family and so on. But by and large, people in rural Poland, in eastern part of Poland, are very happy about it, and these are the crucial areas which still support Kaczynski. On the other hand, you have Trump, who delivered tax cuts for the rich, and not much in terms of like a social welfare programs. It's true that he's very good on immigration issues, but that's another different story. How you combine your promises on immigration and social policy. But Trump, I think, if he combined more progressive social welfare programs, he would have even more success, for example, in his own country. Then. From those very general observations, I move to my third point, which touches upon the relationship between law and populism. So when everything started in Hungary and Poland, there was this kind of assumption still originated from the beginning of the transition from the 1989 when the communism fell down, that the legal institutions can really do a lot in order to protect democracy. So many people, for example, tend to believe when Orban was elected, we have this strong constitutional court. These countries, unlike Brasilia, have the centralized model of judicial review. I don't know how much you know of it. So it's only one top court in the country that can review the legislation. Other regular courts have no power to do that. In Brazil, you have the American, the diffuse system, right? So, and no surprise, it was pretty easy to capture one court. So once you capture the top court, 9 judges, you got rid of the most important legal opposition to your own program. So Orban was very skillful, the Hungarian prime minister. Orban is a very good lawyer, by the way, and he has a very good cabinet of very skillful lawyers. So he knew very well how to proceed. So the first target was the Constitutional Court, then the next target were the media, then opposition is of course legally allowed, it's there, the elections are held, but he went through all the critical pillars, element of constitutional liberal democracy, which are so essential to maintain the equilibrium between the political parties, because otherwise, you have formal rights, but in the end, you have really little chances in your opposition if you don't have access to media. So in Hungary, it was very easy because media was very much controlled by the state money, state government. So very quickly, the government withdrew all the money, and now the media is basically looks like a Fox News in America, so there's just praise of Trump. So there's no critical discussion about Orban. In Poland, for example, the situation is different. So Poland is lucky that it has, it's called like the New York Times of Eastern Europe, Gazeta Wyborcza, which is run by the big dissidents from the 1989, Adam Michnik and others, who still maintain a strong opposition voice, criticize the policy and so on. So even between the two countries, there's an important, huge difference, but the fact is that the Orban script, which was quote-unquote invented by Orban, is now pretty much being followed by other countries. So capture the Constitutional Court, then do the same with the media, then follow basically with the other independent institutions such anti-corruption offices, independent central banks, and so on. And then in the end, they go after the regular courts. The regular courts are much more difficult to capture because they are dispersed. There are thousands and thousands of lawyers sitting on different courts, regular lower courts, both in Poland and Hungary. And after 9 years, Hungary is no longer functioning democracy. And it used to be the most developed post-communist democracy in the region. In 30 years, both Poland and Hungary were considered to be the success stories of the post-communist transition. So the belief was that, with these strong, vibrant legal institutions like constitutional courts, it would be relatively easy sort of to at least not to completely prevent, but to slow down this first attack of the populists. So, but now, judging retrospectively, we can see that the belief was very, very naive. So there wasn't much that constitutional courts and other independent institutions can do because they had a powerful, democratically elected prime minister who had support, from half of the people of Hungary, and after a while, it appeared that the legal institutions actually were not much of help. So basically, he was able to finish this quick legal revolution in 2 years. So it took him only 2 years to change the nature of the regime from a established democracy, or the Freedom House calls it, I think it's a different term, something like a functioning democracy, now to non-liberal, non-established democracy. So based on these two stories, then the perception of the importance of law and legal institutions slightly changed. So now sort of the prevalent take in the literature, if you read the first very comprehensive books by Tom Ginsburg about the American case, Wojciech Sadurski about the Polish case, seems to be rather skeptical about the role of legal institutions. Their basic point is, and I'll borrow here the metaphor from Tom Ginsburg, that legal institutions function more like speed bumps. When you ride on the street, you have these speed bumps which prevent you to go too fast. So they slow you down a little bit, but they can't prevent you to achieve their goal. And that's exactly what happened in both Hungary and Poland. So the lesson is that we should get rid of this sort of over idealistic expectation as lawyers of the possibility of legal institutions to do this impossible work. And for example, the conclusion of some authors, including Ginsburg and his co-author, is that it's actually not the legal institutions, but it's the vibrancy of people on the street, of Democrats, of protests, who are essential to protect these kind of attacks of populists on the legal institutions, which is kind of counterintuitive for most of us lawyers who think that law is here and democracy is here, and we use law in order to sort of protect the excesses of democracy. But, and here I'll connect this part of the story with the second part, where I turn to the missing link in the story, which I call of course, the political economy link, and I'll explain this connection earlier just to finish the story about legal institutions. So the second take is much more pessimistic. Basically says, if you have strong social movements, strong opposition parties, then you're a good way to protect your democracy. So don't ever emphasize the importance of legal institutions. And already the comparison between Poland and Hungary tells you that the truth is somewhere between these two statements. That we shouldn't be, of course, too optimistic about the legal institution, but also that we shouldn't be too dismissive. And Poland is actually, I would say, a litmus test for that, because Poland is having elections this fall. It will be after the first term of the government. And you can clearly see that Poland is not Hungary. So Poland is not that far. We cannot call Poland authoritarian government, authoritarian regime. And there are many different reasons for that. First, it's a tradition. With the opposition movement, Solidarność created as opposition to communist regime. The strong local government traditionally were present in Poland, historically for a long period of time, and the media, for example. So we also have to look at these particular features of different countries which do not necessarily exist in other parts of the world. That's why earlier emphasized the importance of this having in mind the varieties of different forms of government, not to assume that Poland is just another Hungary. Then my critical point on the literature is that there is, of course, a missing link. Like if you read one of the best accounts of populism, not only in Eastern Europe, worldwide, by Jan Werner Müller, the political scientist at Princeton, like in his book, What is Populism, he doesn't mention neoliberalism, he doesn't mention economy, he doesn't mention 2008, no financial crisis. For him, Syriza is not a populist, Podemos is not a populist, Bernie Sanders is not a populist. For him, populists are only right-wing authoritarian populists. And I think the problem is for many of people like Jan, I would say his description is completely correct, but only as applied to Hungary and Poland. Once you apply his definition of populism to other parts of the world, there's something missing there. And what is missing is that there are, of course, that can be different forms of populism. So what is Bernie Sanders not if populist? What is Elizabeth Warren not if populism? There are apparently two different forms of populism, at least, you know? Broadly speaking, authoritarian populism on one hand, which prevails in the current world, and the democratic progressive populism on the other hand. And in the literature, you have this rich tradition. You know, the Argentinian thinker Ernesto Laclau wrote about this democratic populism a long time ago, and his partner Chantal Mouffe just published a book for a left populism talking about this different version. So, and I would claim, and I argue, this is my more current work, that the important critical distinction between the two forms are their takes on the political economy. So if you just focus on the, you know, constitutional public law forms deviations of populism from the standard constitutional democracy, you tend to think that populists are basically guys who, I mean, supporters of authoritarian populism are basically the guys who are racist, chauvinist, people who support, you know, all kinds of, you know, right-wing, semi-fascist, semi-authoritarian movements. But that's not the case. You know, if you look, you know, and there are good empirical studies being done in many parts of the world, showing that, you know, yes, you have also people like that who support your own president here, but you have also many people, desperate, poor people, who are, you know, left behind in many different ways, who are just disappointed with previous governments and are trying to find, help in this new different right-wing populist authoritarian regimes. The same applies to America, to Trump supporters, and also if you look at the UK, there's a very nice empirical study of economists from Warwick who shows a strong overlap between the strongly hit austerity counties of UK and the support for Brexit in those times. So there's a strong correlation between this economic aspect and the support. How much time do I have? 1 more minute or not?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. And so why is this important? So once you bring into the story the political economy, you're able to distinguish the true reasons, the true causes which lie behind the rise of populist authoritarianism. Without that, you tend to think, and you side with those who mostly think that it's culture. There's this huge debate about populism initiated by Pippa Norris, whether it's culture or whether it's economics. And Pippa Norris strongly argued for culture. This is all about long-term demographic trends, you know, old versus young people and so on. But, you know, in the political economy debate brings in a completely different story, because if it's about culture, it's very little you can do about it at the moment. You know, culture is a really long-term trend. You can change culture. You can't change culture in 5-10 years. You need more than that. If it's political economy, then we know that we can do something about it. So that's why I claim that by understanding the political economy reasons behind the authoritarian rise, you can better understand the logic of populism, and second, you can better promote the alternative proposals. So many liberals, for example, which I fully support, right now in the EU there's a huge debate what to do with Poland and Hungary. And my best friends in the field, they all are just, you know, spending all the time trying to figure out how to impose sanctions from Brussels on Poland and Hungary because they violate, there's this Article 7 in the European Treaty on European Union, which says that European Union is an organization of free countries based on democracy, rule of law, and so on. But I'm afraid that sanctioning these authoritarian governments would even further strengthen their support among the people. If you're getting financial support from your government, and if your government is being sanctioned by you, then you know wonder what the net result will be about the people of Poland and Hungary about those imposed sanctions. So, so that's pretty much my kind of a call for bringing into the story a strong dose of political economy, and also from legal perspective, there's also the old tradition based mostly in America of a they call it sometimes popular, sometimes populist constitutionalism, which tries to conceptualize these different democratic progressive strengths based on the experience of America in the early 20th century and some other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
Vou tentar espelhar a minha ideia para ele poder ver a apresentação.
Dá para ver isso?
So
Apresentação.
I'm sharing with you my presentation so that you can see what I'm Não, tô falando só pra ele.
Ah, tá. Sua apresentação tá no desktop. Aí. Você podia
So, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
So thank you very much for the invitation, being here. I'd like to thank you very much the organizers, to thank you for being here. So my name is Carla Bezerra. I'm a PhD candidate at the Political Science department here, and I'm also a lawyer, so I'm happy to be holding both visions from political science and law. My presentation today is a paper that I presented previously on the American Political Science meeting. It's about why has participatory budgeting, orçamento participativo for the Brazilians ones that are more used to the name in Portuguese. Why did it decline in Brazil? So this is a paper that I co-authored with Murilo Junqueira, who is a professor at the University of Pará. So the outline will follow what is participatory budgeting, because not everyone is very used to it. What scholars say about its decline, and then I will show, so my work is mostly empirical, so I work with both qualitative evidence and also quantitative analysis, and then I will sum it up. So, what is participatory budgeting? This is a picture of a neighborhood assembly in Porto Alegre, the city where participatory budgeting first began. And it may be several things. So this is in the same city 22 years after. So in the first one, it's just a neighborhood meeting where everyone is voting. And the second one, we have like computers. The government goes around with computers and citizens will decide which are the priorities for the budget. So, but the main idea is that participatory budgeting is a democratic innovation where citizens have the opportunity of helping define the priorities of the local budget. So this is an innovation that began in Brazil, but then it went all over the world, and that's why it is important. So it has been adopted in several countries. Mostly, the most successful ones are in Latin America, Europe, and also Sub-Saharan Africa. There are some cases in Asia, but they're not really relevant. They were not very successful. And it has been, World Bank and several UN agencies have acted as promoters for the PB. But while in the world it keeps expanding and diffusing, it has declined sharply in Brazil. And that's what I'm trying to understand why. So in Brazil, it has been adopted for around 256 municipalities in the whole period that I'm analyzing. So I have data up to 2016. And what we see is that it was rising up to 2004, and then it begins to decline. And participatory budgeting was mainly promoted in Brazil by the Workers' Party. And the period in which it begins to decline coincides with the period that it goes to the federal government. So it's kind of counterintuitive. Why did this happen? If we look by party, we can see clearly that it is strongly related to the Workers' Party. So the second party in Brazil that adopts in bigger quantity is its opponent, PSDB. But it's very, very low, as you can see. I don't know, so this is PSDB, and this is PT. So you can clearly see that PT is the main party promoting, although if we look at left parties, proportionally numbers of prefectures, the other left parties also have a great share of the participatory budgeting participation. If you look at geographical distribution, you can see also that it's concentrated where you have more population. So it's mainly a program that was adopted in bigger cities, like more than medium to bigger cities. So what do scholars say about its decline? So we have several scholars that say that it's related mostly to administration and party continuity or discontinuity. So when the Workers' Party is governing, then you lose the election and the program is interrupted. But that's not enough to explain it, because it has been interrupted in situations that you have party continuity. So others have added up in the argument. You have also to look at the executive-legislative relation, because also the participatory budgeting is used as a tool to govern in a minority government. So this like when the government has an advantage, it may also explain why it continues or not to adopt the other scholars have also tested some economic variables. Espada is the one that has tested, but he found no results. And he has also reinforced the previous scholars saying that, well, it's mostly just about having or not having the Workers' Party. And also other matters. So my question is like, okay, the Workers' Party is the main promoter, but then when it got to the federal government, why did it stop promoting it? Because the argument goes around without answering this. If it was a successful policy, it should be highly expanded when it got to the federal. So there is something in the policy that was not working. So that's what I'm trying to look. And Spada has tested some economic variables, but he found no results in his model. And I have strong qualitative evidence to say that economic variables are important. And also I tried to test in a model replacing some of his economic variables. So I look at two cities, Recife and Belo Horizonte. They are interesting cases because they have had participatory budgeting for over 20 years, both of them. And they have also had the Workers' Party and PSB, another left party that shared, and they were kind of interchanging seats. So it's not only about, so you can look at the effect of other political parties and the continuity of them. So what we have in both cities, we can easily find newspapers information about heavy debts. So we have, this is just one news that I found about Recife. So created by the PT 14 years ago, participatory budgeting of Recife has still overdue demands. From 1,045 works that have been received and decided by the citizens, only 180 had an executive project. So what we can see is that citizens would make the demands, they would establish the work, but it would not get done. We don't have the work being done. So this generates frustration among citizens. The Belo Horizonte, although it's a richer municipality and with more administrative capacity, it has more or less the same situation. So participatory budgeting adds up to 1 billion in unfinished works. So this is news from the 2017. So this is a strong evidence to say that, well, something in the policy was not working. And as you have citizens deciding that these are the priorities and the works are not done, this doesn't give any political results. So it tends to be gradually abandoned. So my hypothesis, this is my puzzle. What we have, not only in the year 2004, we have 2003, we have the Workers' Party arriving at federal government. We also have the effects of the fiscal responsibility law that was issued in 2001. And it has gradually reduced investment expenditures at a local level. There are several econometrics studies that show that investment expenditures have been reduced up to 20%, just as the law got in. And this is because municipalities may, when they have to adjust for personnel, so if you have to expend up to 50% of all that you have in personnel, you may either increase your revenues or cut on your expenditures. And usually what municipalities do is they cut on the expenditures. And the only part that they can actually cut is on the investment one, because most of the budget is mandatory. It's very rigid. And that's my argument. Increasing local municipality budget rigidity creates several constraints that decrease very much the discretionary of the mayor. That was the idea, in a way. This was not made just by case. There was this idea that local governments are corrupt, and there is a way of controlling and guaranteeing that things get done is by restraining their freedom. And so this has other, sometimes unexpected effects, and that's what you're looking at. So we also have revenues and expenditure linkages for health and education. So we do have federal transfers that also constrain the local discretionary options. So this creates increasing fiscal constraints for local government. We also have another phenomenon that is like participatory budgeting began in the late 80s, beginning of 90s, where most of Brazilian cities had been grown, had expanded, their peripheries were really, we didn't have any basic sanitation, services, paving, and as we have the most simple works done, like paving, basic paving, then you have to do like more complex city works. And these ones demand more time. You have to expropriate land. You cannot do this in 1 year. You have to take several years. And sometimes works don't get done by the electoral cycle. So this generates frustration as well in citizens. So, my whole idea, so this is like step by step the argument. We have increasing fiscal and administrative constraints that create lower effectiveness of PB, participatory budgeting, of the citizens' decisions. You create a negative feedback, and then this has lower electoral returns. So if you have lower electoral returns, parties will not adopt it. This was a way that the Workers' Party gradually stopped promoting it, and then the policy gradually was abandoned. This didn't happen in the world because we still have the World Bank promoting participatory budgeting as a best practice worldwide. So my analysis, I don't know how many of you are, I don't know if there are economists in the room. This is a fixed effects regression model. I add up most of what previous scholars have put in the model. So we do have the participatory budgeting as a dependent variable. And then we have several political variables that we test. For example, incumbent party, it's a dummy. Do you have workers' party, not workers' party? Political continuity. So we do have a measure for each one. And this is a kind of an adapt for what previous scholars have done. Our main innovations here are the economic variables and also the population control. Okay. So I'll just jump into the main conclusions and the main findings. So here we have the effect. So what we have here is when we have the Workers' Party as an incumbent party, and we interact population and time. We have here, this is the effect before 2003, and the lighter one is the effect after 2003. So what we can see is that actually what we already knew is that the Workers' Party was acting stronger as a promoter before 2003, and then it decreases gradually. It does not promote the PB very much. Only in the bigger cities it keeps the tendency that it was similar to the period before 2003. So we kind of confirm with data that the Workers' Party is not acting as a strong promoter, is not promoting the participatory budgeting anymore. I'll skip this. So this is our most interesting finding. So the blue line, I don't know if you can see. Yeah, you can see. So the blue line is cities without PB that have a higher budget per capita. They are more likely to adopt participatory budgeting. But having a higher budget per capita does not affect, so you have a flat line. It means that it has no effect at all in the continuity of participatory budgeting. It means that a richer city, although it has a bigger budget, it has no effect at all in keeping the program. But on the other hand, if it has a higher investment rate, is more likely to keep the budget. What it means? It means that, for example, if you look at the city of São Paulo, it is the third GDP of Brazil, but it has a very rigid local budget. So it may have per capita investment rate, a very high budget per capita, but when you look at investment rate, it's not significant because everything is on the mandatory expenditures, so you will not be able to actually adopt properly the participatory budget. So summing up, what we have is our findings confirm what previous scholars have found, that PT is the most important promoter. Also that bigger population, actually previous scholars did not control for population, so this is actually an innovation. Having a bigger population is very important. And for continuity, it's also important to have political administrative continuity. Our new findings, what we add up to the model, is that higher budget per capita and higher is very important for the first time adoption, but it's irrelevant for its continuity. And what counts actually is the high investment rate. That's what defines. And this, coming back to our puzzle, to our hypothesis, that the increasing fiscal constraints have actually created a situation in which it was not interesting to adopt participatory budgeting. It kind of confirms our initial hypothesis. So this is a paper that it's a working paper. We are still working on data for after 2016. Probably what we'll see is that it has even, participatory budgeting in Brazil almost doesn't exist anymore. It's less than 50 cases nowadays. So that it will just add up, and then we are working in a new paper to measure for state capacity as well. This was not tested in this model. And well, I'd like to, any comments and suggestions and things that were not clear in the presentations, since this is a working paper and we plan to submit very soon, I would be very happy to hear any feedbacks and comments. Thank you very much.
Vou fazer a dança das cadeiras agora.
Eu não sei se ele ainda tá online. Era bom ter.
Yeah.
Acho que eu vou sentar ali para poder ver a sua apresentação.
Tá, claro. So, like Raquel said before, my name is Enrique. I'm a PhD student here in the University of São Paulo, and I want to start on a very quick personal note to just say how I am completely stoked to be here and helping organizing this event. So Mario and Diogo talked a little bit earlier, and Dave too, about how formalistic and doctrinal law education in Brazil is, and they were not kidding. I almost dropped out of law school because of it. And one of the reasons I stayed is because I went to a law and development conference in 2014 that Diogo and Mario organized. And Dave was there and Jed was there too. And I thought, well, that actually looks interesting. Maybe I don't have to go look for another undergraduate degree. So to be here helping to organize an event that's like that last one that really inspired me is a big honor for me. So I really thank everyone who's here and everyone who came from afar. Also, I wholeheartedly thank Professor Diogo and Mario for helping frustrated students like me, and also help my friends and colleagues, Raquel, Bia, and Pedro, who have been along for the ride. So just a quick disclaimer before I begin. I still have this is based on my dissertation, and I still have a long way to go on my PhD, still 2.5 years. So there's a lot of hypothesis raising, not much in the way of conclusions, but I hope there's still something interesting here. My presentation is about the strange variation in institutional stability between Brazilian and South African economic councils and how to explain that variation. So first things first, what are the councils? The economic councils. So they are formal arenas in which a limited number of representatives from certain social segments directly engage with the administration in talks over economic policy. So it can be a lot of different things depending on what there is. It may be wage setting. It may also be incentives for specific sectors of industry. It depends and it varies a lot. But they are vehicles for contact between public and private interests. They are interesting in that they allow participants to directly engage with one another and negotiate and revise their positions. So it's a bit different from one-off consultations. So in academic jargon, they can be classified as deliberative and non-electoral governance institutions because none of the people who are there are elected. This is a picture from the South African National Economic Council, about which I'm gonna talk a bit more soon. So there's a good deal written in comparative literature about the roles these economic councils played in the intermediation of interests between government, business associations, and trade unions in comparative Europe, and also in constructing linkages between bureaucrats and industrial conglomerates in developmental East Asian economies. But there are two very important remaining gaps in the literature. First, very little is known about how these councils go from contingent to persistent ways of processing policy. So we know something about their effects, but we don't know why they are created and how they become institutionalized. And second, while this kind of institution has been present in other contexts, there is almost nothing. There's almost no theorization about their functioning outside of Europe and East Asia. So these are the two gaps that the research tries to tackle. So if you look at South Africa, ever since its redemocratization, which happened in the early 1990s, there has existed one single economic council, the National Economic Development and Labor Council, the NEDLAC. It has been long criticized inside and outside of government, but its formal structure remains untouched ever since 1994. So it's a very stable institution. By contrast, if you look at Brazil, ever since the redemocratization which happened in the late 80s, so close to South Africa, we've had a bunch of them. And there's a repeating pattern. They are created, they function for a few years, they stop functioning, and then the next person comes, creates a new council, the council replaces the last one. And if you go back in history, that actually has been happening ever since the 1930s. So it's been going on for a long time. So in South Africa we have a pattern of institutional stability, and in Brazil we have a pattern of serial replacement. And as I'll talk about soon, that's a bit weird because these two countries are very similar in a lot of the conditions that should explain institutional stability. So the literature on European corporatism has been grappling with this stability problem. The East Asian economy, no. So we only have the explanations that have been made for Europe. And there are three important explanations. The first one is a functionalistic one. It says that if you have a coordinated variety of capitalism, where economic actors organize a lot of their interactions through cooperation, long-lasting cooperation instead of competitive markets, councils play important facilitating functions. They make information exchange and planning easier, so they are good for everyone. They have a function to play inside a system. So if you have a coordinated variety of capitalism instead of a liberal one, it's more likely that you're going to have stable councils. The second one is a cultural/ideational one, based on ideas. It says that countries where there's a propensity for consensus seeking and tolerance, especially inside the bureaucracy, there should be more durable deliberative governance institutions. This has been used especially to explain the persistence of corporatives in the Netherlands. And lastly, there's a coercive power-based explanation that says that government will include class interests in negotiations only if those class interests are strong enough to veto policy reforms that they didn't discuss previously. So if you try to pass an economic reform and the labor unions are so powerful that they can mobilize and stop it from going on, the government is forced to include them in negotiations before trying to pass the law. And if you look at the Netherlands, it makes a lot of sense. They have one very old and very important economic council, the SIR, which is the acronym for a Dutch name that I can't pronounce. And it has been functioning since the 1950s, so it's extremely stable. It was an inspiration for the creation of South African and Brazilian councils. And it makes a lot of sense that it's been there because the Netherlands is a textbook example of a coordinated market economy. As I said before, they have a traditionally consensus-seeking economic bureaucracy, and they have extremely strong industrial and trade unions. They're organized in a classic corporatist way. If you look at Brazil and South Africa, though, it gets a little bit weirder because those two countries are similar, very different from the Netherlands, but they have varying outcomes. So, first thing, there's a lot of discussion how not much discussion actually. There's some discussion on how to fit these countries in a variety of capitalism framework. There is no consensus about it, but no one would say that it's a coordinated market economy like similar to Germany or the Netherlands. Second, the economic of bureaucracy in neither of those countries has a tradition for consensus seeking and tolerance. They have had democratic transitions relatively recently, and a lot of their economic policies have traditionally been constructed by centralizing developmental state bureaucracies. Lastly, while the labor unions played very important roles in the redemocratization in both South Africa and Brazil, they are not comparably strong with the Dutch ones. The South African ones have been said to have had very little influence on economic reform since the redemocratization. The Brazilian labor unions have been able to veto a lot of changes in labor market policies but they too have been losing a lot of power. They are very strong compared to the Latin American ones, but not much compared to the Dutch ones. But in South Africa there is instability, and in Brazil there is instability. And now there's I go to my hypothesis that I'm working with so far. I think that there is reason to think that the way that these councils, that the rules that distribute there's reason to think that the variation is due to how their legal construction distributes opportunities for the exercise of power. So in Brazil, change always follows dynamics that are internal to the administration. It's always some ministerial change. So the minister who was responsible for the councils leaves, the next one doesn't care about them, and it stops functioning. Or there's a new president, and the new one doesn't like participation very much. Or there are some sorts of internal conflicts, like the councils deciding things that are against some of the minister's interests. And the changes always happen because are always associated to some dynamic internal to the administration, despite the fact that industrial associations and labor unions have continuously expressed an interest in having formalized representation in economic policy. In South Africa, government has also had a lot of problems with councils, with their council, but it has not stopped it from functioning. They after redemocratization, after the first few years, they got in a lot of conflicts with labor unions, especially the COSATU, the biggest labor federation in the country, because the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa ever since the redemocratization, took a strong neoliberalizing turn after they went to power, even though they always had a communist socialist developmental perspective that was closer to the labor unions. They have tried to avoid submitting bills to the NEDLAC, even though they are legally obligated to do it. And they went to the point that in 2012 they went after a legal opinion saying that they don't actually have an obligation to consult the councils on economic on change to economic policy, even though it's very clear from law that they have. So the council persists despite of administration, and I think this has to do with how they are legally constructed. The first variation has to do with formal changes, the most obvious way in which institutions can change, and so they have to do with secondary rules of change. In Brazil, the councils are usually regulated to true legal instruments that can be unilaterally changed by the executive, like portarias, which can be changed by ministries, and decrees, which can be changed by presidents. So something can happen like it happened this year. Bolsonaro, our current president, passed on two very controversial decrees where he extinguished many of the national level councils on economic and social policy, one of them being one of the economic councils. And there was nothing anyone could do about it because the council was regulated to a decree, which he can change unilaterally. He also wants to change, and he has talked about changing the ones that are created in law, but he hasn't been able to do so. And because his relationship with Congress is very rocky, he might have difficulty in doing it. On the other hand, in South Africa, the NEDLAC is regulated through an ordinary law, which would have to be changed by Parliament, and through internal regulations, which can only be changed internally by the NEDLAC, which demands that they have 2/3 of all participants agreeing to change. So something like in the NEDLAC, like the government looking for a legal opinion that they don't have an obligation to consult the councils, that would not make much sense in Brazil. They could simply pass a decree and change the rule. They wouldn't even really need to extinguish the council. They would only need to extinguish their legal obligation. And the second dimension has to do with primary rules of how people conduct themselves inside the councils and informal change. So you don't really need to formally extinguish a council to make it stop working. If you have all the power to control how it works internally, you can just stop making it function. And in Brazil, all the councils usually concentrate all the power of how these councils are internally administered in the hands of the administration. So they get to decide who participates, they get to decide what issues get tabled, they get to decide, they get to preside all meetings, they don't need to submit changes to policy. The councils don't have their budget, they are discretionarily fixed by the administration. So if you don't want a council to function anymore, you don't have to pass a decree, you just have to stop calling. You can just stop calling meetings, and this has happened a lot of times. This calling to the left. There are rules. There's a comparison between the Brazilian economic and one Brazilian council, but it's very representative of all the other councils that came before it. In South Africa, on the other hand, internal rules of power distribute chances to manage councils very actively between the participants. So the participants, the people who get to participate, are defined by legally defined class associations. So, for example, the COSATU has one spot, and they define who gets to sit there. The executive has no authority over it. Everyone can table anyone can table issues. Presidency is rotating between segments. Administration has to submit all economic reform bills, even though they've tried to circumvent that in various ways. They have their own budgets, and they can propose bills directly to Congress, so they don't depend on executive necessarily doing anything. So if you get one president who doesn't like councils very much, it can just function on its own, independently of the executive, even though it may not function as well because one of the segments is not as interested in making it function. So again, these conclusions are very tentative. I'm not trying to say that law to fall into sort of what Bojan was describing lastly, that if you have institutions designed in a certain way, you're going to have stable institutions or unstable institutions. But I think this is a very important variable to explain the variation between South Africa and Brazil. It is an explanation based on power and coercion, but the power resource are not the association's organizational capacity. It's how these councils are legally constructed. Finally, in terms of a more theoretical conclusion that tries to dialogue with this focus on institutionalism, I'm trying to argue that law isn't something that's external to politics. Like, it's not something that only matters when someone does something wrong and you can go to the judiciary about it. It matters every day because actors interact in an environment that's legally constructed, and law affects policies by unequally distributing opportunities for the exercise of power. And that was it. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Henrique. Thank you for all these fascinating presentations. I will take questions, comments. One here, another one there, and then the third one here. Can we start? Yeah, Mario.
First question is
Mario, just one thing. We have to get. Everyone has to make questions on the microphone because otherwise Michael is not gonna hear, and also we can record the sound. Yeah, there's a cord, but
It's not very long. Yeah, that's it.
yeah, you're gonna have to walk here.
My first question is to Carla, and I'd like to learn more about the crisis of participatory budgets. And I was wondering if the PT in the federal government is one of the causes for this decline, but for another reason. it seems to me that you brought a cost and benefits analysis for the participatory budget. So the fiscal responsibility law increases the costs, and there is no the same benefit. So why we should keep the participatory budget? But I was wondering if the capacity of federal government to implement local public policy could contribute to this decline of participatory budget in the following way. Many local policies or local demands were attended by the federal budget, so making the local participatory budget unnecessary. For instance, programs like My House, My Life, Minha Casa, Minha Vida, or others could improve local sanitation and other local demands. So the federal government plays the role as sort of shadow regulator, as my former student Claudia Costa studied in his master dissertation. She showed that Caixa Econômica Federal, a state-owned bank, played the role of shadow regulator. So Caixa Econômica was able to improve local conditions as a shadow principle. So this is my question for you. And for you, Enrique, don't you think that you should compare presidential system with presidential system? Because there are a good literature on how regulatory agencies in presidential systems are executive dominated, and how regulatory agencies in parliamentary system are Congress or Congress dominated. So perhaps the difference between South Africa and Brazil has to do with the broad governmental system.
So personally, okay. To make it quick, because I have questions for each. So, starting from Enrique. So, why do we care about stability? Because if you're not going to expand beyond other examples, it's like, so South Africa is more stable, but it's also non-functional, as you sort of like lay it out. So it's like stability versus non-stability. They're both sort of like these types of councils don't work, from what I can tell, most places.
Okay.
So why is that like? And so for Carla, I know it's not in your particular project, but it seems like all the debates about participatory budgeting have this effect that I sort of talked about earlier today, where it's like people think participatory budgeting is good because participation is good, right? And there's a new sort of thread of scholarship in the U.S. Sort of led by Sabeel Rahman, talking about participation in government, and it all comes from this participation is good, and so therefore we need to maximize it. But it seems like you have a natural experiment here, where you have this massive increase and then this massive decline. So whatever output justification there is for participatory, budgeting, it seems like this would be a great way to test it, like what was actually happening when it was in effect, and what has sort of been lost, if anything, because so many of the arguments about participatory budgeting, sort of, we're sometimes weak on like, should we judge it from an output basis, or should we just judge it on a procedural basis? And then for both of this, I always tell people this thing where there's some of my family lives in a part of the U.S. where people have bumper stickers on their truck, one that says like, Bernie Sanders, and one that says Trump, right? So they voted for Bernie Sanders and they voted for Trump in different contexts. And so there's been this huge debate about, can you really like explain it all economically, right? Independently of like xenophobia or racism or these other things. So, because it seems from the way you describe it, it's just like, yeah, we know that like neoliberal center-left parties sort of dug their own grave, and so all we really need to do is like have a reinvigorated left that can offer the same things, right, from a welfare state perspective as these new sort of right-wing, nationalists, and that will like suck away all of their energy. So is it as simple as that, of sort of like a new sort of reinvigorated, true left that's able to take away that type of sort of economic basis for these other types of policies, or are there going to be, other significant barriers to that?
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Leslie Armijo from Simon Fraser, and I think I'm probably one of the few political scientists here. So this is for both. I think maybe some of the political science literature would be useful in definitions of two basic terms you're using, democracy and populism, because we've gone through various iterations. These days, I think most people talk about democracy, they distinguish between electoral democracy and liberal democracy. And I think that's what you're talking about. Like the meaning of liberal democracy is basically you have civil liberties, protection of minorities, blah, blah, and that's what's lacking in purely electoral democracies, but they still have open elections. And then on populism, the same kind of comment. This is a little bit of intellectual history. When I came into the populism debate, it was when political scientists were arguing with Latin American economists who used the term populist to mean left populist. That was Juan Perón and Julio Vargas and Alan Garcia in his first iteration in Peru, and so on. And so the political scientists, this would be Stephen Levitsky, Kurt Whelan, they were saying, no, let's define populism in political terms without economic, and leave the economic content to be an additional adjective. You can have left populism or right populism. So in that case, populism, and I think it's still standard, at least in North American political science, populism means a leader who is anti-elite, or at least his rhetoric is his or her rhetoric is anti-elite. Cristina Fernandez, for example, and who tries to go directly to the people. And so it's a political thing, and then you can combine it, and that will solve some of the arguments you're having with people, I think.
One more.
Thank you first for the presentation. My question goes to Professor Borgrik. Specifically, something which you haven't mentioned at length in your presentation, but I think it's something pretty interesting that you mentioned officially, is the international sanctions. Because I'm not a political scientist, I study international law here at USP, and the specific thing which you mentioned was that conservative governments and conservative parties, when they are in government, they tend to look inwards and sort of like push aside an internationalization and community making, and you mentioned the specific case of the EU, but I'm working more closely with the reform of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. The fact that after the Belo Monte disaster, Brazil sent various recommendations for reform into the Inter-American system, and what happened was that the commission, after the commission sent, you have to do this because the Belo Monte disaster happened, Brazil complained and they reformed the system, and now the commission's feeling more complacent to Brazil and other countries. And the question is that it seems like a big dilemma. At the same time, the countries and the states actually, the states, the international organizations, they want to impose sanctions. They want to make international law or community law effective. But at the same time, if they push too much, those countries will, push them aside. And in the end, they are parties. They are made up of big, small parties of the states themselves.
So, Boya, if you want to start, let's just go at the order we
Okay.
talked.
Okay, so Jet was first. Oh, microphone. Sorry. So, is this one working? No, not working.
You have to take the.
This one?
Yeah, just turn it on. Just press.
Is it working? No. No.
It was on already.
Is it
Yeah. Now it is on.
No, it's on.
It's working.
you have to switch the other one. Switch off. Yeah. Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah?
No, maybe this one isn't working properly.
So let's use this one. Okay. Okay, so quickly, by the order of question. So Jet was first. Thank you for the question. Yeah, this is a very frequently asked question, and my answer is to an extent yes, but in its entirety no, because of course it's not all about left-wing economic policy. That's why I mentioned that globalization is more than just about moving goods and services and capital. It's also about moving people around the world. So unless you have a clear stance on immigration, you're not very likely, to overcome this sort of deficit compared to the right-wingers who seem to have a very clear message to the people about the immigration. But on the other hand, if you look at the very few at the moment empirical studies which show from where it comes the most strong support for the right-wing authoritarians, you clearly see the pattern that those are economically most affected areas. But that does not mean that only reverting back to some kind of left-wing social democracy would solve the problem. You have to work on both premises for sure. And you can clearly see, I think, right now in the democratic debate here, or with some left social democratic movements in Europe, that actually the left is very weak somewhere on the both pranks, but somewhere on the immigration prank, because they don't seem to manage somehow to find enough popular solution to counter the simple offers by the radical right-wing authoritarians. So no, there are no simple solutions that would just try to figure out some kind of a return back to the social democratic combination of welfare and social policies and things like that. Although the pattern of switches for voters very clearly shows, for example, in Austria, was a very good analysis that who were the people who moved to the Freedom Party, the far rightist party. It was mostly the disappointed former voters of Social Democrats who went there, not entirely, but to a large extent. Second question or suggestions by Leslie. I use all these authors, all these terms. Where is Leslie? Oh, it's right there. All these terms. Actually, there's also a third notion from political science which is used very much in this literature. I didn't have time, of course, to go over this, which is competitive authoritarianism, which is a very key word. So how to distinguish between Poland and Hungary. Hungary seems to be already, almost there, whereas Poland is not yet there. Poland seems to be still working to some extent, liberal constitutional democracy. And as to the second suggestion about populism, yes, I know this tradition of the use of the word populism by, there was this study in 1990s, Edwards and somebody else, about the economists, where populism mostly meant irresponsible fiscal policies in Latin America. So, and yes, it is both. It is first defined populism regardless of the economic policy, and then move to the left and right-wing populism. So I think the Ziblatt-Levitsky book is a good example of that. But even more popular definition comes from a Dutch-American professor, Karl Smude. So his definition seems to be the prevalent among but which basically follows the suggestion that you mentioned earlier. And then the third one by where is the student? Yeah, I didn't hear your name, sorry. Enrique. So Enrique, about the sanctions, my response would be, yes, that's exactly the dilemma that you mentioned, and how it works in and how to explain it in the context of EU, because I don't know enough about your case. Actually, there's a very good economic study of the history of sanctions done by Kenneth Rogoff and somebody else, which shows that economic sanctions work very well when there's a strong consensus on the normative side of why are we imposing the sanctions. And that's precisely what is lacking in EU at the moment, because there are many countries in Europe, like Italy has its own populist government, Austria had one, now it collapsed, so we'll see what will happen, and many others who don't agree actually with the fact that Orban is a bad guy. Even in Germany, there are parts of Germany where Orban is welcomed as a hero. Like, the CSU, he's a regular guest in the Bavaria at the meeting of the Christian Social Union. So he's like the right guy who is defending, the Christian values of European Union. So if you don't have that agreement, then I would say it would be more likely in Europe that the sanction would actually strengthen Orban and Kaczynski than the opposite. Thank you.
Não, ele não terminou a pergunta, né?
So thank you for the questions. So Professor Shapiro, you do raise a very interesting question. I have so the idea is that federal investments may have overshadowed the need for participatory budgeting. But the thing is that big federal investments for local municipalities only began in 2007, more or less. So much later than when we see the decline, and this really didn't change any of the trend. So like huge investments such as PAC, Programa de Aceleração do Crescimento, and Minha Casa, my house, my life will come only much later. So I don't think this would explain, but I do in my PhD dissertation, I do investigate some of the reasons and what were like the Workers' Party strategy in the federal government for promoting participation, and why did it not adopt participatory budgeting at federal level, because it had it in its political program. So I do investigate some of them. We can talk later about it because it will be too long for here. For Professor Kronk, so I do agree that most of studies in participatory issues tend to be normative, strongly normative, and like promoting participation is good. And how can we look at it? So I don't think that this case is exactly a natural experiment, because we are observing variation within different municipalities. So although the number looks like a natural experiment, but we are looking at different. So some municipalities adopt, others drop. So, but I do know some pair matching studies so they look at municipalities that are very much similar in GDP, population, any socioeconomic issues, and they compare the ones that have adopted PB and ones that have not, and they look at social indicators, and they can see if the effect was actually good for social development, democracy at local level or not. So some scholars that do that are Brian Rampler and Roberto Pires, which was also mentioned here today by Professor Coutinho. So I don't know if I answered all the questions, but.
So very quickly, first, Mario's point, I do think comparing the broader political systems is also important, because, well, I said that it matters if it's a decree or a law, but how easy it is to change a law depends on other features of the political system. So how hard it is, maybe very different. It's very different in different countries. So maybe much harder or easier in South Africa than it is in Brazil, and those other features may affect stability. The reason I didn't talk about it is that I didn't get around to it yet, but I do agree that it's important and it's going to be part of the work. And about Jed's comment, I mentioned that the NEDLEC has been heavily criticized, but that was to show that there's some conflict of interest, that law makes a difference in taking for one outcome or the other. I did not mean to say that the NEDLEC is or other economic or that the economic councils are dysfunctional. So not necessarily. There's actually a lot of written about some of their effects, and a lot of great people argue that they can matter a great deal. I think the best thing I know about them is one small book by Ben Schneider in which he compared a bunch of different councils in Latin America and trying to find out when they make a difference and when they don't. And I got the argument from him that these institutions were under-theorized outside of East Asia and in Europe. There are good, even though the Brazilian councils have been very unstable, there are a lot of great people that also argue that a lot of them had important effects, especially the Câmaras Setoriais, and even the more recent Council for National Development got. I'm a recent council, and there is no consensus also that the NEDLEC in South Africa is non-functional. Some people argue that it is non-functional. Some people argue that it's not perfect, but it would be much worse without it. And it has had an important role in some debates. Even recently, they passed a law on minimum wage in South Africa, and it was actually written by the NEDLEC. So I don't know. I don't think you can say it's necessarily dysfunctional, and stability matters a great deal, I think. Even though a stable council is not necessarily a good one.
Michael, do you want to? Michael?
Michael, are you listening to us? Can you hear us? Oh, he can't hear us.
You're on the wrong mic.
It's not.
But I think all of them should work.
Michael, you cannot hear us?
Try with this one. I think this one should work.
This funciona.
Ask him.
Yes, okay. If we don't have any more comments from the panelists, I would like to thank everyone and to say we'll have a quick coffee break. It's 15 minutes, and then we're going for our next panel on corruption. Stay tuned. That's it.